Other representatives on mission, meanwhile, had also taken to attacking the outward manifestations of the Catholic religion. At Abbeville, on the edge of priest-ridden Flanders, Dumont favored forced public abjuration of orders, preferably by constitutional clergy whose continued loyalty to the revolution could only now be proved by such gestures. On 7th October in Reims, Ruhl personally supervised the smashing of the phial holding the sacred oil of Clovis, used to anoint French kings. None of this was authorized by the convention. On the other hand, the adoption on 5th October of a new Republican calendar marked a further stage in the divorce between the French state and any sort of religion. Years would no longer be numbered from the birth of Christ, but from the inauguration of the French Republic on 22nd September 1792. Thus it was already the year 2. There would be 12 30-day months with evocative seasonal names. Each month would have 3 10-day weeks, decades, ending in a rest day, décade. Sundays, therefore, disappeared and could not be observed unless they coincided with the less frequent décade. The introduction of the system at this moment only encouraged representatives on mission to intensify their lead, and de-Christianization became an important feature of the terror in all the former centres of rebellion when they were brought to heel. Once launched, it was eminently democratic. Anybody could join in smashing images, vandalizing churches. The very word was coined to describe this outburst of iconoclasm, and theft of vestments to wear in blasphemous mock ceremonies. Those needing pretexts could preach national necessity when they tore down bells or walked off with plate that could be recast into guns or coinage. Such activities were particular favorites among the revolutionary armies. The Parisian detachments marching to Lyon left a trail of pillaged and closed churches and smoldering bonfires of ornaments, vestments, and holy pictures all along their route. Other contributions took more organization, but Jacobin clubs and popular societies, not to mention local authorities, were quite happy to orchestrate festivals of reason, harmony, wisdom, and other such worthy attributes in former churches, and to recruit parties of priests who, at climactic moments in these ceremonies, would renounce their vows and declare themselves ready to marry. If their choice fell on a former nun, so much the better. When Chomet returned from Nevers, the Paris Commune made de-Christianization its official policy. On 23rd October, the images of kings on the front of Notre Dame were ordered to be removed. The royal tombs at Saint-Denis had already been emptied and desecrated by order of the convention in August. The word saint began to be removed from street names, and busts of Marat replaced religious statues. Again, the convention appeared to be encouraging the trend when it decreed on 20 October that any priest, constitutional or refractory, denounced for lack of civism by 6 citizens, would be subject to deportation, and any previously sentenced to deportation but found in France should be executed. Clerical dress was now forbidden in Paris, and on 7 November, Gobel, the elected constitutional bishop, who had already sanctioned clerical marriage for his clergy, came with 11 of them to the convention and ceremonially resigned his see. Removing the episcopal insignia, he put on a cap of liberty and declared that the only religion of a free people should be that of liberty and equality. In the next few days, the handful of priests who were deputies followed his example. Soon Grégoire, constitutional bishop of Blois, was the only deputy left clinging to his priesthood in clerical dress. The sections, meanwhile, were passing anti-clerical motions, and on 12 November that of Gravilliers, whose idol had so recently been Jacques Roux, sent a deputation to the convention draped in ornaments from churches in their district, spoils taken from the superstitious credulity of our forefathers and repossessed by the reason of free men, to announce that all churches in the section had been closed. This display followed a great public ceremony held in Notre Dame, or the Temple of Reason, as was now redesignated, on the 10th. On this occasion, relays of patriotic maidens in virginal white paraded reverently before a temple of philosophy erected where the high altar had stood. From it emerged at the climax of the ceremony a red-capped female figure representing liberty, appreciatively described by an official recorder of the scene as a masterpiece of nature. In daily life, she was an actress, but in her symbolic role, she led the officials of the commune to the convention, where she received the fraternal embrace of the president and secretaries. However, carefully choreographed, there was not much dignity about these posturings, and attacks on parish churches and their incumbents, who were mostly now popularly elected, risked making the revolution more enemies than friends. Small-town anti-religious Jacobin zeal, for example, provoked a minor revolt in the Brie in the second week in December. To shouts of "Long live the Catholic religion," "We want our priests," "We want the Mass on Sundays and holy days," crowds of peasants sacked the local club. Several thousands took up arms and joined the movement, and only a force of National Guards and sans-culottes from the revolutionary army restored order in a district whose tranquility was vital to the regular passage of food supplies to the capital from southern Champagne. But even before this, the Committee of Public Safety was growing anxious about the counterproductive effects of de-Christianization. Robespierre in particular, who believed that religious faith was indispensable to orderly, civilized society, sounded the alarm. On 21st November, he denounced anti-religious excesses at the Jacobin Club. They smacked of more fanaticism than they extinguished. The people believed in a supreme being, he warned, whereas atheism was aristocratic. At the same time, he persuaded the committee to circularize popular societies, warning them not to fan superstition and fanaticism by persecution. On 6 December, finally, the convention agreed to reiterate the principle of religious freedom in a decree which formally prohibited all violence or threats against the liberty of cults. But by then it was too late. The example of Paris had encouraged Jacobin zealots everywhere. And with the repression of revolt in full swing, and the role of priests in the Vendée particularly notorious, the remaining trappings of religion were too tempting a target to ignore. The Commune's response to Robespierre on 23rd November had been to decree the closing of all churches in the capital. And soon local authorities were shutting them wholesale throughout the country. By the spring, churches were open for public worship only in the remotest corners of France, such as the Jura Mountains. But then, Perhaps 20,000 priests had been bullied into giving up their status, and 6,000 had given their renunciation, the ultimate confirmation, by marrying. In some areas, such as Provence, de-Christianization only reached its peak in March or April 1794. On the other hand, it was scarcely a movement that could go on indefinitely. When most churches had been closed and stripped of their furnishings and relics, and had no incumbents, what more could be done? All that remained was vigilance against continued religious practice behind closed doors. But the Committee of Public Safety, in the law itself as enunciated in the decree on the freedom of cults, were against such harassment, and the reach of both from the end of 1793 was growing ever closer and more sure. The dangerous chaos of de-Christianization, in fact, seems to have been one of the most important factors pushing the Committee of Public Safety towards taking a firmer grip on the government of the country. It was certainly when the anti-religious paroxysm was at its height in Paris that the revolutionary government proclaimed in October was given a structure and a chain of authority under a decree constituting revolutionary government, first proposed on 18 November, passed on 4th December, and known from the later date under the Republican calendar as the Law of 14 Frimaire. The principle animating it was extreme centralization. Executive power, subject always to the overriding authority of the convention, was vested in the Committee of Public Safety in matters of internal administration and police. An executive council of ministers was still maintained, although billowed therein in the course of debates on the proposal, repeated Danton's earlier call for its abolition. But it was now downgraded to a passive channel for transmitting the orders of the two committees. And all subordinate authorities at whatever level were expressly forbidden to alter, gloss, or interpret the law in any way. The obvious targets of this provision were the representatives on mission, who, for much of 1793, had ruled their assigned territories, subject to hardly any central control. They were, it is true, to be entrusted with the first application of the Law of 14 Frimaire, but it was to be their last great assignment. Subsequently, the execution of revolutionary laws at local level was to be the responsibility of district and commune councils. who would report directly every 10 days to the governing committees, the departments, a consistently conservative force since their creation, and motors of federalism in many areas since the spring were bypassed for all except routine administrative functions such as tax collection and public works. But to ensure that the districts and communes discharge their new and wider responsibilities properly, each was assigned a national agent appointed by and reporting independently to the central committees. Meanwhile, all unofficial local bodies set up in the course of the emergency since March, including any local revolutionary ummies, were abolished as subversive of the government's unity of action and tending to federalism. Only the watch committees, established uniformly everywhere in March and now reporting to the Committee of General Security, retained a role, no doubt because the operation of the law of suspects depended on them. Plainly, the committees were now aiming at uniform, obedient administration responding rapidly to central initiatives, and incapable of resisting, adapting, or varying government policy in any substantial way. The spirit of the law of 14 Frimaire was the very opposite of that aspired to by the Constitution makers of 1791, or even in the main, that of the Convention's own suspended Constitution. But decentralization and separation of powers were ideals for calmer times, as Robespierre explained in moving a supplementary measure to reorganize the Revolutionary Tribunal on 25th December. The goal of constitutional government, he declared, is to preserve the Republic. That of revolutionary government is to found it. The revolution is the war of liberty against its enemies. The Constitution is the regime of liberty, victorious and peaceful. Revolutionary government requires extraordinary activity, precisely because it is at war. Thus, the law of 14 Frimaire heralded the end of the anarchic terror. It heralded the end of the depredations of the revolutionary ummies, now reduced to a single force under close central supervision, and the end, by implication, of de-Christianization. Above all, it heralded the end of the proconsular autonomy hitherto enjoyed by the representatives on mission. It established the first strong central government that France had enjoyed since 1787. But although it aimed at a regime of instant obedience, the new law certainly did not take instantaneous effect. It was some months before the last provincial revolutionary ummies were wound up, or de-Christianization began to flag. And this was above all, because many representatives on mission found the trimming of their powers hard to accept. Yes, declared Javogu, representative in the new department of the Loire, created to dismember the old Lyon-dominated Saône-et-Loire. There exists a plan for counter-revolution in the Committee of Public Safety. I have seen signs of it developing wherever I have been. They have tried to turn the revolution back by sending out men who paralyzed vigorous measures. The law of 14 Frimaire was not applicable, he argued, to a department like his, still in rebellion. Only after 2 months of defiance was he recalled. By then, accusations of abuse of power and resistance to central authority by representatives had become a main plank in a campaign led by Danton and his friends to abandon government by terror. It was in this atmosphere that Robespierre sanctioned the missions of Julien to Nantes and Bordeaux, which led to the recall, in turn, of Carrier and Tallien. Ultimately, the Dantonists' campaign for indulgence failed. But by the time it was over, the power once wielded by the representatives on mission had been broken. Yet, the law of 14 Frimaire was not the first attempt to impose uniform practice on the embattled republic. The law of the general maximum had theoretically done so ever since 29 September 1793. It too had encountered initial difficulties. For most commodities, the price it fixed was 1/3 above the local price of 1790. But in many cases, that was more than the current price. And the days before the law took effect were marked by disorderly runs on shops stocking such goods. Local variations in price made supplies extremely uneven, as producers preferred to sell their stocks where prices were higher. In any case, it took far longer for local authorities, harassed by a myriad of other problems, to draw up comprehensive scales of prices than the week allowed between the promulgation of the decree and its implementation. Within a month, the crude guideline of 1790 prices plus a third had to be modified to take account of transport costs and reasonable levels of profit for those who handled the goods. And the provision of the maximum law, which limited the level of wages, was scarcely implemented at all. It would have required a whole extra apparatus of investigation and control. In a place like Paris, the Commune knew that its power ultimately depended on the support of the wage earners who made up the majority of the sans-culottes, and that the wages many of them were earning were already in excess of the maximum laid down. Nevertheless, by November, district authorities were beginning to control prices, at least over much of France. And on 22nd October, supply of provisions on a national scale was placed under the supervision of a subsistence commission, answerable directly to the Committee of Public Safety, and more particularly to one of its longest-serving members, Robert Lindet. He soon became the Carnot of economic organization as the commission took powers to direct bulk purchases, distribute grants, and regulate exports and imports. Above all, it addressed itself to establishing a nationwide schedule of maximum prices for necessities, which was promulgated on 21st February 1794. Despite the draconian penalties of the law against hoarding, the less severe but still serious ones laid down in the maximum law itself, and the informal terror exercised against rural producers over the autumn by the revolutionary armies, the black market flourished behind the spreading apparatus of economic controls. The market was also disrupted by bulk purchasing for the armed forces. When payments were made in cash and, if necessary, at rates above the maximum. Nevertheless, by the spring of 1794, France was obviously making substantial progress towards a controlled economy. The most vivid evidence came from the value of the assignats. Controlled prices diminished the demand for a paper currency, which had been legal tender since April 1793. Consequently, fewer needed to be printed, standing at 22% of their face value in August 1793. They rose to 33% in November and 48% in December. Although from then on they began to decline again. The fall was nothing like as steep as in the spring of 1793, until economic controls began once more to be abandoned in the autumn of 1794. Another factor in arresting the decline of the assignat had been a forced loan on the rich. The principle was first adopted in response to sans-culotte pressure on 20th of May 1793, but despite the urgings of the enragés, nothing was done to implement it until the crisis of September. On the 3rd of that month, however, it was decreed that all income over 6,000 livres for the unmarried and 10,000 livres for families should be taxed on a sliding scale, which at the top end took everything. It looked punitive, but those subject to it were able to discharge their obligations in depreciated assignats, and millions therefore were taken out of circulation. In any case, many local authorities were very slow to identify those liable. Although in the commercial centres of federalism, terror against its now vanquished paymasters produced substantial results. France's wealthy were certainly to look back on the forced loan as one of the most shocking expedients of the Year of Terror. A time they would remember as one of vindictive class legislation. Another example was the decrees passed in the spring of 1794 on the disposal of lands confiscated from enemies of the Revolution, and known as the Laws of Ventose. On 26 February, 8 Ventose, Saint Just moved on behalf of the Committee of Public Safety that the goods of persons recognized as enemies of the Revolution should be sequestered on 3rd March, which would be 13 Ventose. He moved that watch committees should draw up lists of all those detained since 1st May 1789 with a view to their property being redistributed to approve indigent patriots. 10 days later, a further decree established popular commissions to decide which of those listed should be declared enemies of the Revolution and thus suffer confiscation and redistribution of their goods. In practice, little was done to implement these decrees, and what was done was chaotic. Saint Just himself seems not to have thought through the full implications of his proposals, and most of his colleagues on the governing committees were distinctly lukewarm. They supported such populist measures only in order to outbid the Parisian radicals in a new political crisis, which reached its climax in this same revolutionary month of Ventose. Nobody, recalled one deputy later, had dreamed of establishing a system of terror. It established itself by force of circumstances. But that meant that nobody had control of it either, even among those with a vested interest in its continuance. And nobody, above all, seemed to have the power to end it, even when its purpose and achievements came to seem less and less self-evident. To criticize the terror was to risk suspicion of sympathizing with its victims, and thereby become one of them. Yet many deputies, probably most, were deeply uneasy about terror as a basis for government from the start. And as soon as the emergency began to lift, with the first victories over the Austrians in October, the recovery of the centres of federalism in the weeks after that, and the defeat of the Vendéens, pressure began to mount for a less savage way of running the country. Among those sympathetic to this viewpoint was Robespierre, very conscious that needless excesses would discredit the revolution at home and make enemies abroad more intransigent. His attempts to save the Queen and the Girondins, his denunciation of dechristianization, and his strong support for extending the powers of central government in the law of 14 Frimaire were all evidence of his concern. And in this, he had the vocal support of Danton, who called on 22nd November for less bloodshed and played a constructive role in the elaboration of the 14 Frimaire law. When attacked in the Jacobin Club for advocating moderation, he was vigorously defended by Robespierre. 2 days later, the friend of both, the veteran revolutionary journalist Desmoulins, launched a new paper with Robespierre's blessing, the Vieux Cordelier. Its title proclaimed its approach. One critical of the new masters of the Cordeliers Club and leading advocates of continuing terror and de-Christianization. By now, Robespierre suspected that a number of Hébert's allies, if not the man himself, might be more or less willing agents of Pitt, recruited to the counter-revolutionary cause by the notorious royalist intriguer, the Baron de Batz. Their persistent attacks on Danton and his associates ever since the summer fell into place when it was suggested to Robespierre in mid-November by Chabat, ex-monk, ex-representative on mission, and ex-member of the Committee of General Security, until voted off late in September under Hébert's pressure, that there existed a plot of breathtaking proportions to discredit the revolution and set its supporters at each other's throats. While a clutch of corrupt deputies had sought to make illicit profits by manipulating the winding up of the former Indies Company, they had worked to entangle others, this time good patriots like, as he naturally claimed, Chabat himself, so that Hébert and his friends could then denounce them. It sounded less implausible to the suspicious mind of Robespierre than it does today. After all, bats certainly existed, and his subversive activities were well known. And the allegations of shady dealings in Indy's company shares soon proved only too well founded. The Committee of General Security, suspecting that Chabot was only intent on saving his own corrupt skin, imprisoned him when he took his denunciation to them. Robespierre, meanwhile, continued to encourage Desmoulins in his attacks on terrorists and de-Christianizers, and on 12th December stood by when an attempt was made to alter the membership of the Committee of Public Safety itself. Seemingly designed to remove extremists like Bellaud and Collot and bring back Danton. Although it failed, the campaign went on. On 15th December, the Vieux Cordelier compared conditions in France to the bloodiest times of Imperial Rome and made pointed allusions to the massacres at Lyon. On the 20th, Robespierre persuaded the convention to establish a committee of justice to investigate cases of wrongful arrests. By then, what Desmoulins and his friends considered some rightful arrests had been made. Ronsin, commander of the Paris Revolutionary Army, just back in the capital from Lyon, and Vincent, Secretary General of the War Ministry, who had been hinting at a new purge to silence the so-called indulgence. Leading the attack on his occasion, 17 December, was Danton's friend, the poet, Fabre d'Eglantine. Okay, I'm a little out of sorts today because I rarely watch the news. I never watch the news, in English anyway, and Memphis, Tennessee was where I was born, my hometown. I haven't been back there since 2015 at my father's funeral in Memphis there, and I haven't heard anything about Memphis. Haven't thought about it over here in the Tupelo, Mississippi area now, and about the beat-down killing of the guy Nichols there, and I know that neighborhood, and it just, you know, a lot of times it's like, I don't know, I just saw some little something about it and started looking into that, and it's like, you know, it's like I try to avoid the news as much as I possibly can, but considering it's my hometown and familiar territory, I just, you know, it's, and knowing what it was like, you know, what it's like in Memphis since back in the 90s when I first started living there. You know, I spent every Christmas until I was 21 in Memphis, and it's just, to say it's a unique city compared to other situations, and I hope that the remedy is swift, whatever it takes, you know. So the so-called Aberists were at first too stunned to fight back. Those still at liberty were reduced to babbling protestations of innocence. What put new heart into them was the sudden appearance of Collot d'Herbois in the capital on 21st December. Alarmed by news of the arrest of Ronson, his close collaborator in the repression at Lyon, Collot rushed back to Paris determined to vindicate their methods before he too came under attack. He did so by proceeding straight to the Jacobin Club, where he delivered a rousing defense of those arrested. Urged on by Hébert, the club rallied to him and demanded that the accusers substantiate their charges. The effect of Collot's intervention was to reinvigorate defenders of terror as an instrument of government, and thereby to polarize politics in a way not seen since the purge of the Girondins. The polarization extended at first into the Committee of Public Safety itself when Bellaud and Collot were able, on 26 December, to have Robespierre Committee of Justice abolished. It might have continued had it not been for the revelation during the first week in January that Fabre d'Eglantine had been deeply involved in the Indies Company scandal. Robespierre was devastated. Desmoulins, by now, in Vieux Cordelier No. 5, was denouncing Hébert for corruption. Yet, here was the indulgence main spokesman in the convention himself, deeply tainted by speculation and fraud. A bitter denunciation of Fabre at the Jacobin Club on 8th of January marked the end of Robespierre's flirtation with the indulgence. And on 12th January, Fabre was arrested. The only deputy to speak up for him was a personal friend, hitherto little involved in the factional strife of that winter, Danton. Uneasy calm now descended after 6 bitter and noisy weeks. Desmoulins abandoned the Vieux Cordelier, but in any case, repression in the provinces had now passed its peak. Renegade representatives on mission were being brought to heel under the law of 14 Frimaire, and Julien was investigating their more questionable previous activities on behalf of Robespierre. Leading figures were now denouncing the faction fighting between indulgents and Héberists, as the greatest problem faced by the Republic. And when, on 1st of February, Vincent and Rancine were released by the Committee of General Security for lack of evidence to their alleged crimes, Danton applauded the move, but he also called for the release of Fabre as well, which cast doubt on his motives. Vincent and Rancine were certainly unimpressed. They emerged from prison determined to revenge themselves on those who had put them there, and so the factional strife was rekindled. The committees did all they could to lower the temperature. Desmoulins claimed that he was prevented from bringing out further issues of the Vieux Cordelier. But their attempts to stifle dissension only turned the fury of the Hébertists against them, as much as against the indulgents whom they were now accused of protecting. Urged on by returning provincial terrorists like Cartier and Javogou, who were anxious to deflect any punitive action from their own heads, they began to proclaim that a new insurrection was necessary to cleanse the convention of what they called the faction. From their base in the Cordeliers Club, they began to try to stir up the sans-culottes. And by the end of February, addresses were trickling in from sympathetic sectional societies, denouncing disloyal deputies. On 4th March, the club resolved to launch a new popular journal, taking Marat's old title, L'Ami du Peuple. And meanwhile, it decreed that the Declaration of Rights in its meeting hall should be draped in black until the faction was destroyed. Hébert denounced Desmoulins as an enemy agent, accused him of misleading Robespierre himself, and joined in the cry for an insurrection, a new 31st May. On 6 March, Section Marat, where the Cordeliers were located, declared itself in a state of uprising, debout, until the people's murderers are exterminated, and marched to the Hôtel de Ville to demand action. No other section followed its lead, and Chaumette accordingly received the demonstrators guardedly. But nobody mistook the echoes of the previous September. The committees, whose mandate was due for renewal the next week, were now thoroughly alarmed. Paris was restive under a malfunctioning maximum, and every market day saw scuffles around stalls selling basic commodities, while black marketeers flourished. "A fine liberty we have," an unemployed laborer was arrested for yelling at a grocer on 19 March. "It's all for the rich. The only war they're fighting is against the poor. In such conditions, calls for insurrection might be all too readily answered. The committees began to close ranks. Even Collot d'Herbois, having saved his own position, now began urging the Jacobins to rally to the established order and invite the Cordeliers to join them. In one of those curious, aberrant waves of fraternal emotion which sometimes carried away revolutionary assemblies, even at the tensest times, they agreed, and sent the black veil from the declaration as a token of their goodwill. But Vincent and Rancine denounced the gesture and kept on calling for purges. Hébert, somewhat more equivocally, supported them. The Committee of Public Safety waited until its renewal was safely passed. On 11th March, then, stiffened by the return of Robespierre after a month's illness, it struck. On 13 March, Saint-Just, on its behalf, denounced a far-reaching plot by factions of foreign inspiration to destroy Representative Gamut by corruption and to starve Paris. Thousands of copies of his speech were promptly distributed in the capital. It contained much grandiloquent rhetoric in which factions were denounced as divisive of the national will, and insurrection condemned as resistance to the peoples themselves, who now held power. It contained no specific charges against anybody, but on the strength of it, Hébert, Vincent, Rancine, and a number of their followers or presumed sympathizers, 20 in all, were arrested on the 14th and during the days following and sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Fourquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor, was ordered by the Committee of Public Safety to secure a conviction at all costs in what would be a blatantly political trial. Accordingly, they were accused of fomenting insurrection, attempting to create an artificial famine by sabotaging food supplies, and plotting a prison massacre. The trial took place on 21st through 4th March. Its result a foregone conclusion. Among those who went to the scaffold with Père Duchesne on the afternoon of the 24th were Vincent, Rancine, and the leader of Section Marat, Montmorteau. To substantiate the charge of a foreign plot, a clutch of colorful aliens perished with them too, including Clootz, who bade farewell to his beloved human race in front of the biggest crowd ever to surround the guillotine. It was a largely hostile crowd too. In the end, the sans-culottes abandoned those who claimed to be their champions and most faithful spokesmen. Police reports make it clear that ordinary people in Paris were only too ready to believe the allegations cobbled together by Fourquier-Tinville. The Committee of Public Safety must have been relieved. The charge of trying to create famine, the simultaneous introduction of the laws of Ventose, and the wide distribution of Saint-Just's speech of 13 March all showed how anxious it was to deprive the accused of popular support. So, did a special grant made by the Subsistence Commission to steady the price of bread in the capital. But they need not have worried. The failure of the other 47 sections to follow the lead of Momoro's section Marat on 6 March showed that those who had called so emotionally for insurrection 2 days before had taken no trouble to organize forces outside their own neighborhood, any more than they had during their opportunistic triumph the previous September. And even if they had done so, it is by no means certain that their call would have evoked a response. After almost 2 years of revolutionary vigilance and tension, the sans-culottes were showing signs of nervous exhaustion. Much of their program had now been achieved. The law against hoarding, the levée en masse, the general maximum, and a comprehensive policy on suspects, and a government prepared to enforce all these policies with terror. Patriots who had campaigned for all these things over the previous summer thought a government prepared to enforce them deserved support against factions of whatever sort. Many former blood drinkers were now in effect government employees in any case, as members of watch committees, interning suspects and issuing civisma certificates, answerable ultimately to the convention's committees under the law of 14 Frimaire, or simply as paid attenders at sectional meetings under Danton's double-edged resolution of 4th September 1793. Purists might scoff at such 40-sous patriots who had given up the vital right to permanent sessions for a pittance. In many sections' unofficial alternative assemblies, sectional societies sprang up over the autumn, but the most energetic, practical, and experienced sans-culottes had been creamed off into the state apparatus, and from that perspective were prepared to see Hébert and his friends as suspicious and ambitious troublemakers, stabbing in the back a government which was winning the war both at home and abroad. Yet, it proved the end of the sans-culottes as a political force, and the end of the Paris Commune as their independent mouthpiece. Chaumette, though not arrested with Hébert and the others, was picked up 4 days after their execution, and he and a group of presumed sympathizers, including ex-Bishop Goebel, went to the guillotine in their turn on 13 April. The presumption of sympathy came from the fact that it had taken the Commune almost a week to congratulate the convention on thwarting the alleged Hébertist plot. On this pretext, too, the convention decreed a general purge of the Commune's personnel which left it, by the end of April, the docile tool of the Committee of Public Safety. The same charge of guilt through silence condemned the stunned revolutionary army, which Ronsin was supposed to have been preparing to lend force to the alleged insurrection. On 27 March, it was dissolved, to the general relief of the peasants, priests, and comfortably off citizens it had so spectacularly terrorized. The end of the terror foisted on the country by the bloodthirsty populace of Paris seemed to be at hand. Few foresaw how long it had to run, or that, firmly in the hands of the government rather than the sans-culottes, it was destined to get worse before it got better. And that's the end of chapter 11.